I first encountered Endo's work shortly after I had spent 2 years serving as a missionary in Japan for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormon Church. And because of my experiences there, trying to learn a very difficult language, dealing with a country where Christianity is not by any means in the majority, it's about 1% of the population. I felt like there was something I could relate to when I read about silence and what it was, the subject matter. And so I picked it up in English translation, read it, and was just totally bowled over by it and thought, this is a writer I'd like to read more of. I need to improve my Japanese reading ability to do it, but I'm going to read more of his work and maybe even examine it as I get into graduate school. I spent a year doing dissertation research in Japan, and then I've been back I can't even count the number of times. And while Endo is still alive, he passed away in 1996, I was able to get together with him. My wife got to meet him and got to know him quite well, and just kind of hanging out with him helped me better understand him as a person, as a Christian, and as someone who had really great compassion for other people. He tends to be a relatively easy writer to translate, and I say that in the context of modern Japanese literature, because you look at someone like Kawabata, who won the first Nobel Prize in 1968, or Oe Kenzaburo, who won in 1994 when everyone thought that Endo was going to get the Nobel Prize for literature. But you look at their writings, and there is so much that draws on the Japanese style of abstractness and vagueness and confusion of expression that makes Japanese literature in the classical period so beautiful. But Endo was much more influenced by French literature, especially French Catholic writers. And so he tends to write in a more accessible kind of language, especially for me as an American translator and for Western readers, because his concerns about this Western religion in Japan are also the kind of concerns that we can share as Christians in the world outside Japan. So as far as difficult to translate passages, well, I guess my biggest challenge, I'd have to admit, was translating Deep River, because being set in India and with so many references to Hindu deities and traditions within the Hindu religion, there were many things that I had to just scratch my head about and contact experts in Hinduism and even ask Endo, what in the world are you trying to say here? And he was very helpful and accommodating in responding to that. But those were my biggest challenges. And also the samurai set in the early 17th century presented challenges of the historical background, the setting, those kind of things, because I never lived in 17th century Japan, and there are many areas that appear in the book that I have never visited myself. So I had to really rely on external sources and imagination to be able to translate those. I think for our day and age, as we have gone through the 20th century and all of its horrors, and now experience more horrors in the 21st century, I think one of the most important themes, messages, if you will, in Endo's writing is that Christ is a figure who is like a loving mother, someone who will always be at your side, who is eager to forgive even your worst mistakes, and is there through all of your sufferings to suffer alongside you. There's that wonderful line in Silence after Father Rodriguez is about to place his foot on the image of Christ, the fumie, where the voice of Christ speaks to him and says, go ahead and step on me. It was to be trampled on by people like you, all of you who are suffering as human beings. That's why I came into the world, to be with you, to share in your pains, and to let you know that I am always there with you. Endo had a very troubled relationship with his father. And so, like many Japanese Christians of the mid-20th century, he had difficulty relating to a father in heaven. And so when he mentions God or writes about God, he really is talking about Christ. For him, and there certainly is an aspect of Marian worship in his attitudes, but it's because it was his relationship with his mother that was most influential on him in forming an image of Christ/God. And therefore, it was an image that was there to be with him, as I mentioned before, to guide and protect him, and most especially because he saw himself as being a very weak human being, a very weak Christian who always stumbles and makes mistakes and commits sins. It was very important for him to have an image of Christ as someone who was quick to forgive, because he understood how difficult it was to live mistake-free in mortality. Not difficult, impossible to live without committing sins on a regular basis. And so you have this Kichijiro character in silence who is constantly apostatizing by stepping on the image of Christ and then coming back and saying, I want to believe, I want to be a Christian again, I want to have faith. And then he does it again. And he keeps stumbling and falling, but he gets up again and he comes back. And he will not leave the side of the priest who is there to minister to the Japanese during their times of persecution. And that, for Endo, is the image of who Christ is and how he relates to us. The samurai, the title character in that novel, travels, and it's a historical novel, travels through Mexico, Nueva España, and then on to Europe, actually has an audience with the Pope. But throughout his travels, all that he sees in all these Christian countries are these figures on crucifixes that are this emaciated man. And he thinks of the images of the Buddha in his own country and thinks, man, this guy on the cross is a real loser. I mean, how can anybody have faith in or worship him or feel like they're getting anything of spiritual value from that figure? But as he goes through his own travails on these travels, and is rejected and essentially persecuted throughout his travels before he returns to Japan 7 years later, and then returns to a Japan where Christianity has now been banned, and because he was baptized as an expedient for his mission while he was in Europe, he is then forced to commit suicide. And at that point, he realizes, that emaciated man is just like I am. I am the one who is suffering as though I had been hung on a cross. And as he is walking down this dark hallway, about to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, his servant, who has become a Christian convert himself, says to him, from here on out, he will be beside you. He will accompany you through all of your pains and sorrows, referring not just to this life because he's about to die, but also in the next life. And whether or not this samurai has, developed faith in Jesus Christ as a historical and spiritual figure, the point is you have someone who understands you, who has shared in your burdens and sufferings, and he is your consolation. He is your hope for now and for the future. And I think that that's a vision that carries throughout Endo's work. I guess for me, what would be most important is for people to look beyond the historical setting of his writings or the exotic setting in a place like India, and look for the deeper nuances of his spiritual vision. Because, telling someone, you really ought to read this book about the persecution of Japanese Christians in the 1630s, I haven't found in my experience that that's going to attract a lot of people to pick up the book, The Silence, for instance. But when I talk to people about, here is a Japanese man who has grappled with what it means to be a true Christian, to really accept what the possibilities for salvation are. And that is a universal concern. And I think you can find a new perspective on your own spirituality by reading something by a Japanese writer who himself had these same issues. That, for me, has been more successful in helping people to approach Endo. And of course, it was, very helpful to have Mr. Scorsese's film adaptation, because I can send people to that, and in 2 hours and 40 minutes, they can get a sense of, wow, what an interesting story, and what an interesting look at faith, and the trials, the travails of belief that all of us go through in one way or another. That has always been a very good avenue for me to introduce Endo since the film came out.